Good day, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you might be around the world. This is, as promised in the last stream, I said I was going to start doing some history streams, and this is the first one I've decided to do. And it's going to be on the troop types, the weapons and tactics of the Napoleonic Wars. And because it's what I know most about, it's mostly going to be about the British Army, but I will also touch upon the French, for example, here and there. But as usual, I'm going to start us off with a bit of music, which hopefully will be appropriate.
Now the drums beat up again for all true soldiers, gentlemen. Let us list and march, I say, over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. Began commands and will obey, over the hills and far away. Gentlemen who have a mind to serve a queen, both good and kind, list and enter into pay. Then over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, the Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. Began commands and will obey, over the hills and far away. No more from sound of drum retreat, will Marlborough and Galway beat the French and Spaniards every day. Over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, the Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. Began commands and will obey, over the hills and far away. 40 shillings on the drum for those who volunteers to come. Shirts and clothes and present pay, over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, the Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. Began commands and will obey, over the hills and far away. The apprentice Tom he may refuse to wipe his angry master's shoes, for then he's free to sing and play, over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, the Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. Began commands and will obey, over the hills and far away. And shall lead more happy lives by getting rid of brats and wives, sold on both the night and day, over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, the Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. Began commands and will obey, over the hills and far away. For if we go 'tis 1 to 10, when we return all gentlemen as well as they, went over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, the Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. Began commands and will obey, over the hills and far away.
Okay, that was Over the Hills and Far Away, and that's actually my favourite version of that song that I can find anyway. And someone in the chat was asking British Grenadiers. Well, if you wait to the end, you might have your wish. Welcome to the chat. Hello, Patriotic Archive. Guys, if you like military music and patriotic music, not just from Britain, but from around the world, do check out Patriotic Archive's channel. It's very good. I get a lot of the music I play on my shows from this channel. Anyway, I said in the last Splendid Isolation stream that I was going to start doing some historical streams, and this is the first result. And it's partly from some comments I got on my Minds channel. I've got a pretty big Minds channel. It's about 4,200 subscribers or something like that. And I got some comments on there from a chat about artillery, actually, in the Napoleonic Wars that weren't terribly accurate. So I thought Stop it. I'll do a stream. This is not going to be a stream about the politics of the Napoleonic Wars. I could do that sort of a stream, but I do enough modern politics, which greatly depresses me for the most part. So this is really going to be more about the different types of troops that were used, the different weapons that were used, and the tactics, formations, that kind of stuff. So to start off with, the central thing to understand about the Napoleonic Wars is that the main weapon of the infantry was a smoothbore musket. Wasn't rifled inside the barrel like a modern small arm is. It was a smoothbore. It was fired by a flintlock mechanism, which was not desperately reliable in the wet, for example. And it was very inaccurate at anything over about 100 yards. 100 meters doesn't make much difference. I mean, if you had like a company, you could probably get some shots on a similar sized target, a company sized target of men at about 150 yards maybe, but anything over that, if you hit what you were aiming at, you were very, very lucky. So the only way that you could use these muskets efficiently was to have the guys in very close order, very close to each other, and march them in time together so they stayed in line, quite close to the enemy, and then fire normally by volleys, which could be company volleys, they could occasionally be battalion volleys, but they were more often in the British Army platoon volleys, which is to say about a quarter of a company at a time. And if you did that, they could be quite deadly at close range, which is to say under 100 meters or so. And if you watch the close order drill, which most armies still do today, for example, stuff that you'll see at Trooping the Colour every year in London, that close order drill, which the guards do at the Trooping of the Colour, is basically the same sort of drill that was done in the late 18th and early 19th century to keep the guys together and to fire volleys effectively. And in fact, the whole Trooping of the Colour ceremony, that again was done so that the troops would recognize their own colors. So the colors were trooped around the soldiers. And obviously each regiment had slightly different colors, particularly in the British Army, because the regimental color, which is a big flag, was in the facing color of the battalion. And facing colors were the colors that were on the cuffs and collars of the red coats that the chaps wore. The Queen's colour, or King's colour as it would have been in the Napoleonic era, that's based on the Union flag, normally. So that's the first thing you have to understand about tactics in the Napoleonic era. Now, I've got a few illustrations that I'm going to put up to illustrate some of this stuff as we go through. So... okay, now this is a British infantry battalion in line. You can see there's the colonel or a field officer, that's to say an officer above the rank of major or above, riding out in front there. And just behind where I'm presuming he's probably the lieutenant colonel, he's probably the battalion commander, you can see the two colours. The regimental colour is blue because this is a royal regiment, which has blue facings. And the King's colour is the one that's based on the Union flag. And in front of the battalion, you can see there are skirmishers. And basically, a infantry battalion had 10 companies. There were 8 line companies. There was a grenadier company who were usually the biggest chaps in the battalion. They didn't use grenades in the Napoleonic Wars. Those had gone out of use, but they were still used to head assaults and this kind of stuff. And there was also a light company, and the light company, although they were still armed with the same smoothbore muskets as the rest of the guys, they were trained to go out and skirmish in pairs in front of the line. And basically they would try and force back the French skirmishers who were in front of their troops. Now, one of the things to notice about, you can see from this illustration, is that the normal British Army attack formation was a 2-deep line, hence the famous thin red line, or thin red streak as it was originally described in the Crimean War. where the British were still basically fighting in the same formations, even though by then they had muzzle-loading rifles. And the British were almost, well, in fact, they were the only nation that fought in a two-deep line. The French officially were supposed to fight in a three-deep line, but they got into the habit during the Revolutionary Wars of not actually deploying into a three-deep line, but in fact continuing on in column. And quite often, because there was a lot of them, and it's quite intimidating to see a great big massive column of men coming at you, the enemy soldiers would break and run away. This didn't tend to happen with the British Army because, unlike the French, for example, and in fact most of the, almost all of the forces in Europe, the same thing applies to the Austrians and the Germans and the Russians, they were all conscripts. That had some good things about it. It meant that you got a big cross section of the nation coming in. But on the other hand, the British soldiers were long service regulars, which meant they were better trained on the whole. Like a British infantryman would be expected to fire about 3 rounds a minute with his Brown Bess musket. Whereas the French mostly probably wouldn't do much better than 2 unless they've been in a long time and they're experienced soldiers. Like some of the Imperial Guard, etc., no doubt could do 3 rounds a minute, but like your average French conscript probably couldn't. And of course, as Bob Toad is pointing out in the chat, the 2 deep line meant that all of the men in a British battalion could fire. Whereas if you're attacking in a French column, and in fact French columns were really rectangles, and they were usually sort of about 8 men deep, but only the first 2 ranks could possibly fire, because if you're the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rank, you just can't, not when you're moving, certainly, because you're going to hit the guys in front of you. So basically, you didn't have, you couldn't bring your full firepower to bear. However, one of the myths about the Napoleonic Wars is that there were lots of stand-up firefights where the British firing 3 rounds a minute was absolutely vital. That did sometimes happen. It happened particularly in really hard-fought battles like Albura, for example, which the British only barely managed to win, basically because Wellington wasn't there. The British were commanded by Beresford, who was a very brave man. He actually fought a French cavalryman hand-to-hand in that battle. Beresford was very brave. He was a very good administrator. He had turned the Portuguese army into a pretty good army. But he was not the greatest field general. And the British only won the Battle of Albura just down to the pure guts of the ordinary soldiers, the NCOs, and the regimental officers. And in that battle, there certainly were occasions when British and French soldiers stood at 50, 60 yards away from each other, volleying into each other for quite a long time. But most battles in the Napoleonic Wars, and certainly in the Peninsular War, which was the main bit the British were involved in before Waterloo, didn't go that way. What tended to happen was that the Wellington was very good at choosing positions. And when the French were attacking, and they often were because there were more of them, Wellington would position his troops on the reverse slope of a hill or something like that. So that, the French didn't know exactly how many men were there. And as the French got near to the top of the hill, the British would suddenly stand up, because Wellington would often have them lie down, so that they were less vulnerable to artillery fire. They would stand up, they would fire 1 or maybe 2 volleys, and then they would charge with the bayonet. And most times, 9 times out of 10, the French would flee down the hill without actually all that much real bayonet firing happening. There was, some of them would get bayoneted if they were a bit too slow, but basically it would just, the French formation would crumble and flee downhill again. That was the most common way that sort of action went. So there's that. Now let me see. There's the next one I want. Here we go. Got another picture to show you now. See if it works properly. How do I do it? Let's do this first. Hello, Dave. How you going, mate?
Oh, I'm very well, thanks.
Only just started. I was just talking about the British two-deep line formation, and the picture I've put up now is actually of a French divisional attack. This is actually from Waterloo, and it's d'Erlon's attack. And you can see this is when we talk about French columns, it's these thick formations here that we're talking about. And you can see that the guys at the rear can't possibly fire. So, you know, they can't bring any firepower to bear. But when they were fighting most armies, like the Russians or the Austrians or the Germans, etc., the mere moral weight of this vast mass of troops would be enough to make guys panic and run away. Didn't work when they were facing the British army. And in fact, this particular attack at Waterloo got broken up by two British heavy cavalry brigades. I'll talk a bit more about cavalry in a bit. And actually got quite slaughtered. So yeah. Now I'm going to talk about the other couple of. There were two other types of. There was one other main type of infantry. The British did have light infantry battalions. These guys were not armed with rifles. They were armed with smoothbore brown bess muskets, but they were trained, the whole battalion, to fight in skirmish chains. Normally, skirmishers fought two guys in groups of two guys, and the idea was that one guy would be firing while the other guy was reloading, and they would cover each other, and they could do that either retreating or advancing. Did you have anything you wanted to talk about that stuff before we go on to the next thing?
Not at all, no.
Okay.
Nothing about that.
Okay, well, the next thing I'm going to show you, very famous, anyone who's watched the Sharp movies, etc., will know about this one. Right. There we go. Yeah, anyone who's watched the Sharp TV series or movies or whatever you want to call them will know about this. There we go. And that, of course, is British Riflemen. Now, the British Rifles, there were two regiments who did it. There was the Rifle Brigade, the 95th Rifles as they originally were, that they became the Rifle Brigade. But there was also the 60th, which today or later became the Royal King's Royal Rifle Corps, but originally were actually the Royal Americans. Although in the Napoleonic era, they were mostly Germans, just to confuse the issue. These guys, they used a Baker rifle, which was a muzzle loader still. It was still a flintlock, but it did have rifling in the barrel, and it meant that you could hit targets you aimed at, certainly out to about 300 yards. Really good shots, maybe a bit more than that. They were actually based on German hunting rifles. They were quite short. And they were fitted with a really long sword bayonet. And even to this day, in the rifles, they don't fix bayonets, they fix swords. Even though, of course, the bayonet sword that they use is the same as everybody else's. Now, these guys... It
could be said that with the rifles, Mike, it could be seen as the beginnings of what we would recognise nowadays as the beginning of the modern infantryman, as in practice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, they were certainly taught to think for themselves because they had to be, because they fought in widely extended formations. So yeah, I mean, they were trained to take cover and make use of cover when they were retreating or advancing. And they gave the British a substantial advantage over the French. Over the French skirmishers, because the French actually got rid of rifles under Napoleon. Napoleon is often thought to be, a great military genius, and certainly he was a great battlefield general, but he wasn't very, he didn't think of many new things. And there were a few rifles in the French army in the Revolutionary War period, but Napoleon actually got rid of them. And so the British had a decisive advantage in that way. The 95th Rifles, generally speaking, formed part of the Light Brigade, which was two red-coated light infantry regiments plus them, whereas the 60th Rifles tended to have a couple of companies given to every brigade in the army. so that every brigade had a certain number of actual riflemen. I also should mention the King's German Legion. King's German Legion were soldiers from Hanover, which obviously was part of George III's. George III ruled it basically, and the King's German Legion were very, very good soldiers. They provided standard infantry, they provided light infantry, some of whom actually did have rifles, and also excellent regiments of light dragoons and heavy dragoons as well. And on one occasion, their heavy dragoons actually managed to break a French square, which is a very difficult thing for cavalry to do. In fact, that's the one that Austrian School Swift is talking about in the chat, Garcia Hernandez. That's the very thing I was just talking about. So yeah, these are your basic infantry soldiers. You've got the line infantry, and of course the guards. Although they are elite troops, they were also basically line infantry. Although they also had their own grenadier companies and their own light infantry companies in the battalions. So you've got those guys. You've got the light infantry still armed with muskets, and then you have your riflemen. So you can put up quite a thick and effective skirmish line in front of your troops. So, where are we? Got that one. And the next one I'm going to go with is this one. Okay, so that brings us on to cavalry. And where are we? I'll find this. There we go. Okay, now cavalry came in two flavors if you were British. You had light cavalry, which was either hussars, like these chaps from the 10th Hussars in the picture, or they could be light dragoons. Light dragoons and hussars basically did the same thing. The differences were really just uniform differences. Light cavalry were mostly used for reconnaissance and scouting and this kind of stuff. Although they could also obviously charge enemy troops, they were also very good at following up a defeated enemy and running them down. So they were quite useful for that sort of thing. So that's your main sorts of light cavalry in the British Army of that stage. The British Army, you'll notice the chap who the hussar is shooting in that picture is actually a French lancer, or probably a Polish lancer of the French Army. And the French used lancers quite extensively in the Napoleonic Wars. The British didn't. We only adopted lancers in 1817, I think. So that obviously you had the 17th Lancers, the famous Death or Glory boys who took part in the Charge of the Light Brigade and that sort of thing. But in the Napoleonic Wars, there weren't any British lancers. And lancers were also regarded as light cavalry. Light cavalry generally, I'm sorry, I haven't talked about organisation, but I'll do that in a sec. I'll go on to the next sort of troops we're going to talk about next, which is, here we go. And this is heavy cavalry. And heavy cavalry were big guys on big horses, and in the British Army, all but one regiment wore red coats. And the light cavalry, by the way, all but one regiment of the light cavalry wore blue jackets of one description or another. But in the heavy cavalry, which is dragoons and dragoon guards, and also in Britain, the Life Guards and the Royal Horse Guards, the household cavalry count as heavy cavalry, because in action, the household cavalry didn't wear their breastplates in action, even in the Napoleonic Wars. But they were still big guys on big horses, and this picture is Sergeant Hewitt of the 2nd Royal Scots Greys Dragoons capturing a French eagle at Waterloo. And he wrote a very graphic account of all the different sword cuts he did against the Frenchmen to do it, including one that went right down through the top of the guy's head into his teeth. So he was quite a big chap, Hewitt. He was about 6'3", I believe. And he got promoted. He was given a commission for this, became Lieutenant Hewitt. And there's actually a pub just below Edinburgh Castle, which is named for him. And the Royal Scots Greys were part of the Union Brigade in at the Battle of Waterloo, and it was called the Union Brigade because it had a Scottish, English, and an Irish regiment in it, so they called it the Union Brigade. And unfortunately, some of them went a bit too far and charged into the French guns and sabred quite a lot of the French gunners. But then, because they'd gone too far and their horses were blown, they got intercepted by the French cavalry doing a counterattack, and a lot of them got killed. But obviously not Sergeant Hewitt. So that's heavy cavalry. The French also had dragoons and all sorts of other heavy cavalry, but the French also had a sort of type of super heavy cavalry, the cuirassiers, who were guys who wore big steel helmets and also breast and back plates, a bit like you'll see the household cavalry wearing in London on parade duties today. And they actually wore those in action. And the British didn't have anything as heavy as that. But what they did do before the Battle of Waterloo, because they knew they were going to be facing the French cuirassiers, was they put sharper points on their swords so that they could actually use the point into a Frenchman's neck or face or something like that, which seems to have worked quite well. So we'll go on to the next one. If you got anything to say, Dave, just go for it, man.
Yeah, of course. I will if I think of something. Yeah.
No, don't worry. Any questions or anything like that? That's fine.
One thing which I should mention actually is that on the subject of cuirassiers, one thing that always surprises me about the subject is that with the breastplates used, the level of protection provided is surprisingly good for a simple sheet of steel. I mean, you see examples in museums and the like of where a dent has been made in the cuirassier's plate by a musket ball or something of the like, and it has been fully deflected, which obviously they did have some worth, although plate armor was, I'm sure, considered obsolete in that period.
It would definitely stop a pistol ball. And don't forget, like, a lot of cavalrymen carried pistols as well as a lot of officers. It would certainly stop a pistol ball. It might stop a musket ball at longer ranges, probably not very close, but at a longer range, it might well.
Yeah.
Now, here we have the Royal Horse Artillery. And you'll notice they're wearing their tarlatan helmets, which are what that headgear is called. And these guys, all of the gunners were either mounted on the limbers or had riding horses, which meant they could keep up with the cavalry. And basically, that was their main job. They used to support the cavalry. Also, there was usually a Royal Horse Artillery battery attached to the light brigade of the infantry as well, because those guys could move pretty quickly. They had a faster marching pace and all this kind of stuff. And the Royal Horse Artillery was a bit of an elite unit of the British artillery. British artillery batteries didn't matter if they were Royal Horse Artillery or foot artillery. Were generally 6 guns in the Napoleonic era period, and that would be 5 cannon and 1 howitzer. And the cannon nearly entirely fired solid iron cannonballs, round shot. They didn't explode, but they would make a big mess, particularly of a thick French column of men. And you could get quite a considerable range out of them, because you could even get them to bounce so that they would go further along the ground. And even a rolling cannonball could take your foot off, as 1 or 2 foolish soldiers found when they tried to put their foot out to stop one. And that was the main projectile they fired, but at closer range they would also fire canister, which was basically a tin can full of musket balls, which turned the cannon into a gigantic shotgun. And that was used at close range against enemy infantry and cavalry and that kind of stuff. The howitzers, on the other hand, as I say, every battery usually had 1 howitzer. Although there was 1 howitzer battery in the British Army in those days. So all of the 6 guns in that battery were howitzers. But generally, a battery would have 5 guns and 1 howitzer. And howitzers had a much shorter barrel, and they were used for firing shells indirectly. So you could fire over hills, you could fire into courtyards of buildings and this kind of stuff. And in the Royal Artillery, you could either fire common shell, which was basically a spherical ball filled with gunpowder, which broke up into a few large pieces of iron, or you could fire, and only the British had this, you could fire shrapnel shell, which meant that was also a spherical ball, but inside it was a mixture of gunpowder and musket balls. And when that exploded, it was actually quite effective. If you could land that over a big column of troops, you could do them quite a lot of damage. That was what the howitzers were doing. But the guns couldn't really fire shells in the Napoleonic era. It was only in the late 1830s that shell firing guns started to become a thing. So that's your Royal Horse Artillery. I've only got a couple more of these now. Where are we going? How do I do this? Sorry, I know. Yeah. Oh, I know. Sorry, I'm doing boomer tech here, guys.
Yeah.
Okay, this is your standard Royal Foot Artillery, and in a foot artillery battery, again it was 6 weapons, 5 cannon, and 1 howitzer. But in a foot artillery battery, most of the gunners actually marched on foot, so they could keep up with the infantry, but they couldn't keep up with cavalry and so on. And generally speaking, British gun batteries tended to be either 6-pounders or 9-pounders. The French tended to use 8-pounders or 12-pounders. So the French artillery was actually a bit heavier than the British, and also there tended to be more French guns around. But the basic thing was the same. Also, French batteries were 8 guns, and they were made up of 6 cannon and 2 howitzers. As I say, the British had 6 gun batteries, but one of those was usually a howitzer. So that's the Royal Foot Artillery, and I've only got one more picture, which I shall leave up while I'm going on about other stuff. If I can find it. Where are we? There we go. I don't usually do all these illustrations. There we go. And that is a British infantry square. It's actually painted, it's supposed to be a quarter bras, which was fought on the day before Waterloo. In the face of cavalry, infantry would form a square, which ideally would be 4 ranks deep. And basically, it's impossible to get a horse to ride into a load of sharp bayonets and guys who don't run away. When an infantry square did get broken, which, as I say, did happen occasionally, it was usually by accident, or the troops weren't very well trained. Sometimes the troops weren't very well trained and simply ran away, in which case they were all going to get sabred. The other thing that could happen is a horse might get shot as it was coming towards the square and slide in and cause a gap. And then there was a chance the cavalry guys could actually get into that gap before the infantry fellas could close it up again. So if you weren't in square, you could get cut to pieces by cavalry in the Napoleonic Wars. And what normally happened was the infantry would move in column because it was easier and quicker, and try and fight in line. If there was some sort of if there was a risk of cavalry attacking, the British would also sometimes fight in a 4-deep line. Very occasionally, it was quite rare, but just occasionally they did. So they're your basic troop types that were used in the Napoleonic Wars, and also the weapons that they were using. Now, you could use round shot up, depending on the size of the gun, you could use round shot up to about 600, maybe 800 even yards. but that was about as far as you could reach. And because, as I explained earlier, your smoothbore muskets were not really much use over 100 or at very most 150 yards, that meant that cavalry still had a good chance of actually closing with infantry if they could, particularly if they could make use of hills and low portions of ground or woods or what have you and surprise them. And it could go very badly for infantry if that happened. The infantry, normally a British infantryman would carry about 60 rounds of ammunition, but it was quite unusual for a battalion to fire that many. And as I said, even if they were constantly firing, you're only looking at 3 rounds a minute, and you wouldn't be doing that for too long. Quarter bras, very underrated battle at one point. Picton was very heavily outnumbered. I was actually talking about Picton on the Splendid Isolation stream on a couple of days ago, because the Welsh removed his statue from Cardiff outside the city hall there. Although the guys in Brecon voted to keep the one in Brecon, I was happy to say. But yeah, Picton was one of Wellington's better commanders. The other really good one was Daddy Hill. He was called Daddy Hill by the troops because he looked after them. And after the Battle of Waterloo, the casualties were so heavy on the British side that in some places where British squares had stood like this, because to let you understand, General Ney, Napoleon's deputy, had launched these great big. He thought the British were retreating. They weren't. They were just moving some wagons and stuff back. But he launched these massive cavalry attacks without any infantry support, which was a stupid thing to do. And so the British spent quite a long time in square. And as long as they were in square, they were pretty safe from the cavalry, because, as I say, cavalry couldn't really break a steady infantry square unless something accidentally happened. But the trouble was, every time the cavalry drew off, the French guns opened fire again with their round shot. And infantry squares obviously make a damn good target for round shot. You know, these solid iron balls which would bounce and pass straight through formations could kill 20, 30 guys at a time if they were in the way. And there were British infantry squares after the battle. You could still see where they were from the dead guys who were still in formation, basically. I don't know. Anything you want to add to that one, Dave?
No, nothing I can add. I reckon. You've covered it as best as possible, I reckon.
Well, as I said, I just wanted to get across to people the weapons and tactics that we used. I suppose I should talk a little bit about the actual units and formations. A British infantry battalion at full strength would be about 900 guys, but they almost never were at full strength. Like most of the battalions of Waterloo were between 500 and 650 guys. As I say, divided into 10 companies. That's a grenadier company, 8 line companies, and 1 light company, who all could do the same stuff, basically, by the Napoleonic Wars, although the light guys were trained to do skirmishing more. The cavalry, a cavalry regiment would have 3 or 4 squadrons, but normally, because cavalry regiments were like single unit things, it was quite common to leave 1 squadron in the UK to act as a training unit. So that quite often, on active service in the Peninsular War of Waterloo, a lot of British cavalry regiments only had 2 or 3 squadrons. And those were divided into usually 4 troops, and each troop would be divided into sections of like 8 blokes under a corporal. So cavalry units tended to be a bit smaller than infantry battalions. Artillery batteries varied wildly in how many men they had. If you look at just look at the batteries of Waterloo, there were British batteries that had 35 guys in them, and there were British batteries of 180, so they varied. And to make it more confusing, in those days, the Royal Artillery drivers weren't counted in the crews, even though they actually would help with that stuff. But anyway, so that was basically your various troop types. The Guards tended to have bigger battalions, just because they were kept up to strength. You know, they were often in London and Windsor and all this kind of stuff. But on average, a British infantry battalion in the Peninsula Campaign and at Waterloo would have somewhere between 500 and 650 blokes, including that's all ranks, including officers, etc. The French were slightly different. The French operated like the British Army. A British Army regiment is an administrative thing. It's not a battlefield unit. So that you might have a British, like the first 25 British infantry battalions, all had 2 battalions. All of them did. But those 2 battalions almost never fought together, because the regiment in the British Army is really an admin thing. Instead, the battalions would be put together in brigades. These were normally 3. They might occasionally be 2 battalions, but they were mostly 3 battalions. And then anywhere from 2 to 3 brigades would be put together in a division. So a division would have anywhere between 6 and 9 infantry battalions in the Napoleonic era. Likewise, the cavalry, normally 2 or 3 cavalry regiments would make up a brigade, and then a couple of brigades would make a division. Sometimes 3 brigades, much more rarely, because the British generally didn't have huge numbers of cavalry. Generally speaking, the artillery was allotted to divisions. You generally find every division would have 2 or 3 batteries of artillery, and a cavalry division would also have 1 or 2 batteries of artillery. But that would be Royal Horse Artillery, as I explained earlier. So that's the troop types. The French were a bit different. The French regiments actually did fight together. In the Peninsula, they quite often had 3 battalion regiments who fought together. At Waterloo, most of them were actually only 2 battalions, although there were a few French regiments that had 3 battalions still at Waterloo. French cavalry was pretty much the same, except there was more of it usually. The other thing to remember, of course, about the Peninsular War is that all the British horses had to be brought there by sea by the Royal Navy. Whereas the French could just march their horses, from France straight into Spain. So that was much easier for them to do. Whereas every single horse that the British had pretty much had to come from England, and it came on ships, which in the sailing ships are not ideal or easy to move horses with. Yeah, the British, as Austrian Schoolswift says in the chat, the British were generally short of cavalry. Certainly until towards the end of the Peninsular War, when it got better. And actually at Waterloo, the British had quite a lot of cavalry at Waterloo. Still not as much as the French, but they did have a reasonable cavalry force at Waterloo. Let me think. I can't really think of anything else, which is because I don't want to make this political. There's not political strain. It's just purely tactics and all that kind of stuff. Some of you will have seen the movie Waterloo, which is not bad. It does have various errors on uniforms and this kind of stuff, but it's not a bad film. It seems to insist the only cavalry the British have is the Scots Greys, which is not true, but there you go. They did make a very famous charge, of course. But let me think. Oh yeah, if you want some good books on the Peninsular War and Waterloo, I would very much suggest Jack Weller's Wellington in the Peninsula and Wellington at Waterloo. Really, really good. Also,
one book that I'd recommend about the Peninsular War is The Spanish Ulcer. It's a very detailed history of the Peninsular War, published in 1984, I do believe. Very good read. You can find it on Amazon.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I haven't read it, but fair enough. I've read a heap about the Peninsular War, to be honest with you. Yeah, another one I was going to suggest is Wellington: The Years of the Sword by Elizabeth Longford. That's also pretty good. The biography of Wellington by what's his name? I'm trying to remember. Richard Holmes. The biography of Wellington by Richard Holmes is also well worth a read. Kinsin, what are you saying here? Rifles in UK skirmishes spec unit, Froggy Baltica's muskets. I don't understand what you're saying there, mate. I mean, this. Don't understand what he's saying there. You got any idea what he's saying there, Big Dave?
So, I think I might have suffered a stroke or something like that.
Yeah, because Baltica's muskets would, they wouldn't be much use to a British rifleman who had a rifle. Far better weapon, and you could fire the rifle just as fast as the musket. There's a couple of YouTube channels I will suggest to people. One is crikey, what's it called now? I will find this while we're sitting here. Where are we? Should be down here. Oh yeah, well, the first one is British muzzle loaders. It's all one word, British muzzle loaders, and that's got lots of information about Brown Bess muskets, Baker rifles, and all this kind of stuff, as well as British Army uniforms in that period. And the other channel, which is really excellent, is Redcoat British Military History. Redcoat British Military History, that's another good channel. And he's actually in the middle of a series about the Peninsular War at the moment. He's going through it battle by battle. So that would be a good one for you guys to check out as well, I would say. Okay, so unless anyone's got anything on the chat or you've got anything else to add, Dave, I'm going to wrap this up in a minute.
No, I don't have anything else to add.
All righty. Any questions in the chat? Ken Sin, the Canuck Brick muzzleloader, is good as a redcoat. Yes, he is. His channel is excellent. Really good military history. Lots of good shooting, and the Redcoat British Military History channel is also another one that's well worth following. The other history channel that I'm going to suggest people follow, although he hasn't done much about Britain at the moment, is Apostolic Majesty. Great channel. I'm actually a bloody admin on his chat, but that's a good channel. So yeah, unless anyone's got any other any other chats, we are going to close this up, I think. What was the most elite cavalry? Patriotic Archive is asking. Well, I mean, in the British Army officially, you'd have to say the household cavalry, so the Life Guards and the Royal Horse Guards. If you're going to look on it purely in that manner, because they're guards, the same as the guards, and I suppose I'd say the King's German Legion the King's German Legion Hussars were also a pretty elite cavalry unit. Most of the British cavalry was pretty high quality, partly because we bred very good horses. Britain was noted in the 19th century for breeding the best horses in Europe, so I think that had something to do with it, for sure. Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll play ourselves a bit of a tune. Hang on, I'm getting another question now. Which units were sent to... okay, that was something I wanted to bring up, actually. Wellington said of his army in the peninsula, and don't forget, he chased the French out of Portugal, out of Spain, and by 1814, the British had invaded southern France. We were actually fighting in France by the time Napoleon was forced to abdicate the first time. And Wellington said of that army that he could go anywhere and do anything with that army. He is very famous for saying that he had an infamous army at Waterloo. And he did have an infamous army at Waterloo because most of the best British units from the peninsula had actually been sent to America, because what America decided was a good plan was, while Britain was fighting for its existence against the French, they decided that they would try and invade Canada. they used as an excuse about free navigation on the oceans, but it was little more than an excuse. The Americans were actually bent on taking over Canada, and they came unstuck because the British and Canadian troops walloped them several times, and all of the American invasions failed. But it did mean that most of the best British troops were sent over there, and as a result, Britain actually captured Washington and burnt down the White House. So we captured the American capital, which the American president had to run away. So Harry Smith, who was a British infantry officer, actually pinched a couple of the president's shirts. Well, that's what they did. So most of Wellington's best troops were still either in America or Canada or coming back across the ocean, which, of course, in the day of sailing ships was quite a long process. So a lot of the units that he had at Waterloo were second battalions. And he also, some of the Dutch troops that he had were militia. Some of them were good. Some of them did fight very well, but not all of them. And some of them had actually been fighting for the French up until about 8 or 9 months previously. So were not exactly reliable. So he did have a pretty infamous army at Waterloo. So he was quite justified in saying that. British sailors would leave the UK for the US Navy. Not all of them would. A lot of them would not. So, some would for sure. Some British sailors also used to leave to go to Australia. They'd leave to go to Canada. They'd leave to go to New Zealand. But, people will always do that sort of thing. Oh, the point he was trying to make were the French used muskets. Not necessarily the case with the Brits. Yeah, exactly. The 60th, the 95th, and also some of the King's German Legion units also used rifles. So, yes, that's very true. Day after the declaration, or did he? Well, there you go. It didn't make much difference. And as I say, I've read quite a lot about the War of 1812, which actually went on to 1814. And the real American reason for doing it was to try and take over Canada. It had nothing to do with what was happening with the Navy. And, by the end of the war, basically all American trade had been stopped. Any American ship that hadn't been captured was actually bottled up in port and wouldn't go anywhere. So it was a very unsuccessful war from the Americans' point of view. And yet some of them still try and claim they won it, which they most certainly did not. But there we go. All right, guys, I'm going to play us out with a tune. Listen, New Orleans, I've got to say something about New Orleans. That was, it was fought after the end of the war. The peace treaty had actually been signed by then. But also Pakenham, who was in charge. Pakenham was a brave soldier, but he wasn't a very intelligent soldier. And that really laid at the root of it, to be honest. The British Navy's actions don't really sound absurd at all. And you've got to remember, look, from the British point of view, America only got independence in 1884, as far as the Brits were concerned. And in the Napoleonic Wars, if you were, and a lot of British sailors did go on to American ships, and also a lot of American consuls would give British sailors fake passes that said they were Americans when they clearly weren't. So, there was quite a lot of stuff that was entirely justified on the British side. And also, don't forget, the Americans were supplying the French. So, there was quite a lot of stuff going on there. Anyway, I'm going to play this tune. This is one from Patriotic Archives channel, by the way. Where are we? There we go. So that was the fife and drum version of the British Grenadiers, which is actually the one that will that was most often played, because it was played by the fifes and drums of the regiment to help the guys keep time as they were marching into battle. Okay, thanks for joining us, guys. Short stream. I think it covered most of the stuff I really wanted to cover. I will at some stage do one on the Napoleonic naval war, and cover similar stuff about sailors and weapons and types of ship and this kind of stuff. So I will do one of those. We might be having another stream Wednesday, Thursday-ish, which will look at an article on nationalism, which I think is quite interesting. But that depends if I can get other people interested coming on and speaking about it, because I'm not going to do that one on my own. Whereas I would have happily done this one on my own, because I know what I'm talking about this stuff. All right, thanks for joining us, guys. Go well, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.